My name is Amada Ulrey. I'm the president of the Institute for In Vitro Sciences, and today I'll be presenting on data audits for method validation, which is very different than data review. We are definitely talking about data audits, which help you assess data integrity of validation packets. A data review is when you are looking at the data to make an interpretation or assessment of the method itself. That's what validation authorities and peer reviewers do. Data audits are when you look at the quality and integrity of the data itself to determine if it can be relied on to make those decisions about the method. It's important to note that a data audit performed as part of a validation assessment is not as onerous as a GLP facility inspection. The focus of these data audits are limited to just the data produced at the facilities that participate in the validation and how it's been captured, transferred, migrated, analyzed, and stored. What's not included in a validation method data audit are reviewing training records at the laboratories, looking at equipment to see if it's been calibrated, looking at overall facility records, SOPs, archives, test system handling, really all of those other components that are essential for full GLP compliance. These are not included in the data audits for validation methods. What is included are looking at the raw data, along with any of the metadata that are available, any intermediate transfer files that are used to move the data from one program to another, the process for importing the information into analysis programs or files, the summarized data that could be available, and the final presentation. So again, it is not a full GLP facility inspection. It will not take that kind of time, and you're not going to be looking for all of the elements of GLP compliance or even making sure it complies with good in vitro method practices. Not all of those elements are included. When you're setting up to do validation work in laboratories, the reality is that although it is recommended to perform all of your validation testing under GLP compliance, it's not always available to you. The laboratories who might have the technology to be able to participate in the validation work might not be GLP compliant. Even when there are labs that are participating in a validation that are GLP compliant laboratories, they all have different in-house processes. So they may have different data capture software or equipment that's grabbing the data at each of the individual participating labs. The people looking at the data within those labs could have different levels of familiarity with the data analysis tools that are required to process the data. This is something that could be addressed during training activities prior to doing the validation, but there still might be some issues with how data are handled. Different laboratories have different requirements for data storage and archival and backup. And even a GLP laboratory might be using equipment that's not part of their GLP scope. So for validation work, it's a good idea to make sure that you know and understand how the data are going to be backed up and archived to assure that they're available without making any assumptions. Also, for any validation work that leads to method optimization as part of the process, there could be different iterations of the data analysis tools that are used and the different spreadsheets that might be analyzing the data. And throughout the time of a validation study, as changes are made, that's an area of risk for things to happen that are unintended. So data audits are not a GLP inspection, as we've already said, and they're also not 100% check on the data. Data audits look at the data from the time they are captured through the transfer into any different analytical programs and compilation in summary information, all the way to preparation and holding it in archives and presenting it in the final report. This includes how the data are held after completion of the study as well. So not just until it gets to the report, but how it's held in the meantime. Data audits are very helpful in that if there are mistakes, it could lead to some corrections and improvements in the presentation of the data so that it is more correct when validation authorities and peer reviewers are looking at the data. Because of this, it's really critical that the auditors have direct communication with whoever the most responsible party for the data is. That way, if there are mistakes, they can be corrected. This slide shows a typical picture of the life cycle of data. So it starts at creation, so where you're capturing the original paper or electronic information for the data, through transfer, so how you get it into an analysis program, the migration of data into that system from the raw data, and then through the analysis, where calculations and manipulations to the data are made according to the protocol and study plan. And then it could also go back around the loop and be transferred from an analysis in one lab into some other statistical information. So you follow it through all of the iterations of transfer and analysis and end with looking at how it is stored. So both the raw data held in its original format and the data as it's analyzed, how that is held and stored. And when you're talking about a multi-lab validation assessment, you could have the data lifecycle at every individual lab, and then it all comes together in the multi-lab summary. And there might actually be some loops there where there's analysis and transfer to different systems, and then finally presentation in the validation report. And you're looking at all of that as part of the data audit and assuring the integrity of the data at each step. The next set of slides give you some tools that you can use to assess the integrity of the data, starting with metadata. So metadata is often defined as the data about the data. It gives you information describing the data readings that you have. So if you can see on this slide where I have a digital example for you, these are OD value readings that are coming off of a 96 well plate format. The data, as we normally think about it, are those points within the plate map. The metadata is everything else attached to that file that gives you confidence that what you're looking at is good data and can be relied on. So it's the file name, it's the location of where the data are saved. It has who read it, when it was read. It gives you information on the plate number. Depending on the system, you could also capture solvents and equipment settings, like if the plate shake was on if there were incubation temperature controls that were maintained, what the OD in this case value actually was set to. So it gives you the context surrounding the data to support its integrity. Another important tool that can be used when you're looking at performing a data audit are using audit trails. So this is an example of a human readable printout of an audit trail. It shows you who was logged in, where the information is saved, file save names. It goes through time from creation of the template to actually reading. It shows you the metadata in this instance as part of the audit trail, all the way down to when the read was finished. So you can trace data from beginning to end, and you have some assurances that nothing unintended happened and there weren't any changes made. Some things you might see in a data in an audit trail of data are if there was data deletion, if there were inappropriate changes made, and if there were rereads. So you can use an audit trail to verify that there hasn't been any testing into compliance taking place. And one thing that helps you to organize yourself when you're doing a data audit is to have a data flow diagram, which can help you track and trace the data through its entire life cycle. It will help you make sure you've double checked all of the appropriate transfers and connections of the data, and that you know where each piece is stored. So here's a fictitious example case study that I've pulled together that's full of different things that we have actually seen over time, just to give you an idea of what might happen during a data audit. So when you perform an audit of the data, you normally say, okay, send the raw data from each of the labs, and then the data analysis files from the labs. Then you look at the summary data, the statistical report, and then the TST, the final submission. What could happen is if the validation management team was not thinking about data integrity from the beginning, and if the labs weren't performing the work under GLPs, you may not have the raw data available. You might actually start looking at the data analysis because that's what you have, and you could see things that indicate that there's potentially a misunderstanding of how to use the tools. You might see things like identical control data across several runs, which could mean someone copied and pasted things inappropriately or incorrectly. Files could be marked as read only, but when you click on the cells, you might be able to make changes, or you might see evidence of changes being made without any indication or information about why those changes were made. There could be manual manipulations that are appropriate for one run, but if that data file was copied and then used in the second run, those manual changes would then be carried to the second run, potentially inappropriately. So you would notice something like that happening if you're performing a data audit. And then you might also notice that data are copied and pasted in several different places or manually entered where they could be linked instead. And in instances like that, you definitely want to double check all of that, because that could lead to modifications being made someplace and not carried to where they should be made farther in the data analysis. And again, This is where it's really important for the data auditor to be able to give this information on these types of findings to the person responsible for compiling these data. So you don't want the auditor or you don't want a peer reviewer to be doing this necessarily, because then you would have a peer reviewer speaking directly with the person who's responsible for the data, and we want to try to maintain some independence there. So a data auditor can do this work and work directly with the whoever is responsible for the data, and maybe get some of these changes made and improvements made to the data to more accurately represent what is available and what is true. So sometimes once you start asking for raw data files and then see how it was analyzed, you realize there are some intermediate transfer files that needed to be used, because it's difficult sometimes to get data from one proprietary program into another. There might be a text file or a CSV file that needs to be created that serves as an intermediate file between the two. And those are really risky files because they don't generally have protections on them. It's easy to overwrite and change things on those files, but they could be managed in a way that protects their integrity. So if they are saved in a folder that has read-only access, or somehow the access is changed so that once that file is created, no changes can be made to it, that could help to improve the integrity of those files. Sometimes you might end up having to do some additional work in the laboratory. And when that happens, then if it's coming as a result of an audit, then you would have the opportunity, hopefully, to request the raw data files. And in that case, if there's additional supplemental data that gets added because of findings in an audit, then you just start the whole process over again. And as indicated here on the right-hand side, you go through that data flow and do an audit and assess the integrity of that data, and then where it comes together with the pre-existing data. What's really nice is that oftentimes, if you have the raw data and you can trace all the way back to the raw data, anything else can be corrected. So if there's one thing to remember, it's to save the raw data files. Those are so important for study reconstruction. And if there's corruption or problems with the data analysis files, that's okay. It can always be reconstructed and redone if you have those raw data files. So there are different ways to ensure the integrity of validation data. You don't have to do a data audit. Many aspects could actually be handled proactively by validation management teams. So if they set up some requirements for raw data storage and require laboratories to send their raw data to a central location for storage, and they talk about how to do the summary data, how to transfer the information, do some training on how to handle the data, then the validation management team can handle a lot of this if there is a knowledgeable team in place. If the labs participating within the validation are GLP compliant labs and they're working under GLP compliance for this work, then you know that they will have the raw data. They will store it in a way that retains its integrity, and everything at the laboratory level up until the point where they send it off will be handled. That will have good, strong data integrity. Sometimes we don't know what the quality of the data are, because maybe we're pulling data that has already happened. It was generated before you were even considering doing validation work, and you're not sure what the integrity of the data are. In those instances, a data audit could be very useful to help you fill in the gaps and get a read on what the quality and integrity of the data really are. In that way, data audits can help to open up to including more data in validations, and allowing labs who aren't GLP compliant, or maybe don't have as much experience, to still use their data, as long as it's assessed to be good integrity. It could still be a part of a validation study. So some top-line data governance strategies for validation studies that should be considered to protect the integrity of all of the data, and to check off some of those areas that we look for in data audits, are to archive and back up all of the raw data files. Very important to do that. This can be done by the validation management team or whoever is in charge of the validation, telling all of the participating labs to retain their data, or maybe they should send it in and it should be held at a centralized location if they don't have the capacity to hold on to that. Using templates and locked spreadsheets for data analysis can also be helpful. You can set up your data analysis so that data can be imported into it in certain areas, but then the labs can't accidentally change things if the formulas are locked and protected. So that's a really nice way to protect things and to have to check your formulas and spreadsheets one time, and then you can rely on them beyond that. And then if you're unsure of where your data are, what the quality is, how it's been handled, then you can do a data audit once you have all of the information compiled, and then you can check the entire flow from start to finish. That's a much nicer way to do it than to do it piecemeal throughout the process as you go along. It's much easier to do it all at once and check the whole flow. And then ideally, you want to place your data audit prior to peer review, so that when your team of peer reviewers see the packet, they also can get the data audit, the outcome of the data audit, so they know if they can rely on all of the data, or maybe if some of the raw data wasn't available, but other raw data is. It's nice context for the peer reviewers to have. So in summary, data audits provide evidence of an acceptable level of data quality and integrity presented in the validation packet. So the inclusion of data audits can really help provide information on the integrity of all data, even if it's from a non-GLP testing lab. So it allows their data to also be used. And data audits can uncover the facts about the data, but they never address motivation. So you can never actually tell if something was done inadvertently or on purpose, but you can see where there are incorrect things and wrong things that might need to be fixed, or you might want to decide to go back and do some additional work on data capture for the packet. And lastly, information from the data audits should help validation authorities and also peer reviewers put all information received into the proper context, so they know if the data can be relied upon, no matter where and how, under what quality system the data was captured.